Over the last quarter century, the NHL has seen dominant dynasties,
The Penguins have won the Stanley Cup!
Cinderella stories,
They did it! The wait is over!
and unforgettable runs to hockey's ultimate prize.
The Kings can wear their crown.
But which team stands above them all? We'll break down the greatest Stanley Cup champions of the modern era, how they conquered the competition, left their mark, and cemented their legacy in hockey history. The debate starts now on the Quarter Century Show, presented by SAP. We welcome you into the Quarter Century Show presented by SAP. I am very excited to be joined by Kenny Albert of TNT, by Arda Orcal of ESPN, and EJ Radick from the NHL Network. Guys, here to discuss the Stanley Cup champion, the best one from the last 25 years. I know, right? Let's get right into it. We were chatting off camera a lot about how this can be so subjective, right? Like there's so many great teams to talk about. But what exactly, Kenny, I'll ask you first, is the criteria for selecting the best of the best?
Well, first of all, Catherine, in my mind, the Stanley Cup is the hardest trophy to win in all of sports. The grind that these tremendous athletes go through over a 2-month stretch to win 16 postseason games. We've heard stories from the Edmonton Oilers back in the 80s when they lost to the Islanders, who had won their 4th straight cup in '83. And some of the Edmonton players walked by the Islanders locker room, and the players weren't really celebrating. They were exhausted. They had bandages, all over their bodies, and it's just a grind. It's grueling. So you have to give credit to any team that gets to the end. There are 32 teams in the league these days, and only one is crowned the winner at the end. So a lot of credit to the champion every year. But when we talk about the best during the last quarter century, I think you have to look at some of the teams that won either back-to-back Stanley Cup championships, or the Chicago Blackhawks, for example, who won 3 over a 6-year stretch, or other teams who reached the final in either 3 consecutive years or, for example, 3 out of a 4-year stretch.
Interesting. How about you, Arda?
First of all, I couldn't agree more on the Stanley Cup hardest trophy to win. Absolutely. I think the elephant in the room for this conversation is going to be the non-salary cap era versus the salary cap era. To me, in approaching this, chose 2 teams, a pre-salary cap team and a post-salary cap team. I think that's going to be a lot of consideration when people are watching this and they're making their own lists, because the teams look wildly different in many ways, pre and post. But also I look at things like dominance, longevity, like Kenny said, but also what did their season look like as a whole? Yeah. What were they like in the regular season versus how dominant were they in the postseason? There's one team that I'm sure we'll talk about later in the show that fits that description to a T.
Yeah, I would agree with that, is that I looked at the whole year because we're trying to pick one out of 25, right? And so I wanted a team that I thought played well in the regular season and was amongst the very best of the regular season, because it's 2 different challenges. Even in the post-cap era, it's still a different challenge to win in the regular season and win in the playoffs. As we've seen with President's Trophy winners, almost never, seemingly, win the Stanley Cup. And I think that's just because it's 2 different challenges. So for me, that's what I looked at, is that year in its entirety, and trying to come up with who we thought was the best.
All right, so no shortage of criteria needed to select the very best of the last 25 years. So when we return, we're going to get right to it. Which team was the absolute best to hoist the Stanley Cup? Stick with us to find out on the Quarter Century Show, presented by SAP, an official technology partner of the NHL, helping the league bring out their best. We welcome you back to the Quarter Century Show, presented by SAP, as we discuss the best Stanley Cup champion of the last 25 years. And EJ, I'm going to start with you. We got your idea of what the criteria is. So who do you have for the best Stanley Cup champion?
Well, I will say Arda has a good point about the cap is a challenging, changed the way things were going to go in this league. But we saw teams pre-cap that spent a lot of money that didn't go anywhere. So for me, I kept it to one team. It would be the 02 Detroit Red Wings, because they have 10 Hall of Famers that are on the roster. They have a Hall of Fame coach, a Hall of Fame general manager. It's a team that was very good during the regular season. And when you look back, it goes back into the last century, but they had won back-to-back with a similar group. So it was really 3 cups in 5 years by that point. So for me, it's just hard to overlook, guys. 10 Hall of Famers on that team. I don't know if you match them up against individual teams that they would have the success and win, because they had their challenges. We talked, Arda, right? They lost the first 2 games of that playoff run at home to Vancouver. But I look at that and I size it up and I say, boy, 10 Hall of Famers on one team, plus a Hall of Fame coach, plus a Hall of Fame GM. Hard to go against the Red Wings from 02.
They might be the best team on paper of all 25. On paper, they have to be.
You know, I agree with you guys as far as if you're looking at 1 year, one champion during the last 25 years, hard to argue with the 10 Hall of Famers and one of the greatest coaches, if not the greatest coach of all time.
Yeah, I mean, the definition of dynasty has obviously changed, right? Like, gone are the days of the 4 straight Stanley Cups for the Islanders, making it 5 straight times, the Montreal Canadiens of the 70s and before that. Like, the definition has changed. And really, when you look at teams in this sample size, you're looking at the Blackhawks, the Penguins won back-to-back, the Lightning won back-to-back. Like, the Kings had a couple like in that era. I look at a team like the 2022 Avalanche. It's still too new for people to put them in the all-time conversation. But they qualified just based on the years that we're talking about. They were dominant in those playoffs. They lost 4 games. They were absolutely dominant. They had an offensive core that rivals most of the other Stanley Cup champions. And then they lost pieces, and you can see how it affected them. Players like Nazem Kadri, et cetera, leaving that team. And they didn't even have the best goaltending, per se, of other teams, Darcy Kemper. But still, they were so elite in each category. I wonder, when it's all said and done, where we will rank them in the Pantheon.
And in the conference final, I was fortunate enough to call those games against Edmonton, and they won 2 of them in highly entertaining, crazy, high-scoring games, and the other 2 were low-scoring, so they did it both ways. And I felt that was also a learning experience for the Edmonton Oilers. Even though they got swept, it didn't really feel like a sweep. And then, you know, they wind up with a deep playoff run last year, but I think they learned a lot by going up against that Colorado team. You know, you mentioned the dynasties, and we all grew up watching the Montreal Canadiens and the Islanders and the Edmonton Oilers. I think what the Blackhawks did, 3 cups in 6 years between 2010 and 15. You know, maybe it wasn't consecutive cups, but it sort of had that same feel. You know, they were right there every year during that stretch.
Had to change personnel a lot, right, Kenny? I mean, we know those
Different
Islanders
goaltenders,
teams,
right?
Yeah,
Different starting
from the
goaltenders.
80s. I mean, a lot of those guys played on all 4 Stanley Cup winners. That doesn't happen really in this generation.
No, I mean, they had the superstars, the future Hall of Famers in Patrick Kane and Jonathan Toews up front, and
Keith, Duncan Keith.
Keith and Seabrook.
Sure.
But whether it was Niemi and then Corey Crawford, different starting goaltenders. How about a guy like Marian Hossa? You look at his career, he loses 2 years in a row. Pittsburgh, Detroit play each other in 2008 and 2009.
On the wrong side.
He's on the wrong side both
side.
times, and then he goes to Chicago.
What a cathartic experience,
Crazy.
right? Like, can you imagine how he felt of all the players?
And then he winds up winning cups with Chicago. But those 2 series, 08-09, when I think back, watching from afar, EJ, you were probably there for all of those games, but those were, you know, tremendous teams. You know, you talk about the 10 Hall of Famers on the 02 Red Wings. Many of them were still there in 08 and 09. And then on the Penguins, you had a young Sidney Crosby, a young Evgeny Malkin, a young Chris Letang, a Marc-Andre Fleury who made the unbelievable save at the end.
Yeah.
Veteran like Bill Guerin came in.
Right,
and,
right.
You know, he
they
was
brought
part
in some veterans,
Yep.
right? And then Pittsburgh goes a long time, right?
Without,
And then win with the same core of Crosby, Malkin, and Letang, 16 and 17 back-to-back, 7 and 8 years later.
You know, when I think about these 25 years, and that decade in particular, you know, you bring up the Penguins and that hole there, we kind of got robbed of that Chicago-Pittsburgh, you know, L.A.-Pittsburgh. Like, we never had, in that window, oddly enough, we never had Crosby-Kane, which you think we would have had, and we just never had that series, which
We
was
also
disappointing.
missed Chicago, New York, 2 straight years by 1 game.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
2014, Rangers are in the final.
Yep.
L.A. wins on the road. Alec Martinez,
Yep.
overtime in Chicago. And then the next year, Chicago gets there, and Tampa Bay beats the Rangers in Game 7.
That's
so
right.
we came within 1 game, 2 straight years of a Chicago-New York
Original
Cup final.
6 matchup. in
The
those years.
Chicago narratives were good too. That 2010 series, you had 2 teams with long Stanley Cup droughts, Chicago and Philadelphia. Then fast forward to 2013, you had 2 teams that recently won a Stanley Cup, so it was almost like a heavyweight title fight in that sense.
Boston winning their first cup in a long time in 2011.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm just still amazed though how we didn't get Crosby, Kane.
I mean, they did win some good teams,
Or
though.
Crosby,
Yeah.
Kopitar. Because those teams, they were all around it, but we just never saw them. We had great series. And when the West, sometimes this happened with, that era just as we started the century where there was a handful of teams that were good in the West, right? Dallas, Colorado, and Detroit at that time was in the West. So sometimes that works against you, right? That pushes you out of the mix. And that was the case maybe we saw with Chicago and LA. They had some great series, Kenny. I'm sure you called some of those games. And even Anaheim was in the mix in some of those years. Still have to get to the final.
How about Washington? How long did it take Washington to finally get past Pittsburgh?
Exactly.
They literally put a plaque on a fountain because of that Stanley Cup championship win.
They have.
Hey, we'll never say never. Kane and Crosby are still playing last I checked, right?
Yeah, well,
Right, exactly.
There's still an opportunity. All right, so we've got the best of the best, but which champions we want to know? We're right on the verge of greatness. Didn't quite get to be a champion. We're going to take a look back at the Quarter Century Show presented by SAP right after this. We welcome you back into the Quarter Century Show presented by SAP. Quite a debate for the best of the best. In our first segment, you went with Detroit, Colorado, Chicago, all valuable arguments. And certainly, you could look at all three and say, yes, they were the best Stanley Cup champions in the last 25 years. But what team that's the Stanley Cup champion was just on the cusp of greatness? And maybe it's one of the teams the other decided on, but I guess, Arda, I'll start with you. A team that you look back on and you thought really close to it, but not quite greatness.
I think that the 2020 and the 2021 Tampa Bay Lightning unfairly will always have an asterisk beside their cup championships simply because of COVID. I think that's unfair to that team and how powerful they were in the league, and they could have gone back-to-back in normal NHL seasons. They were a great team. Their offense was spectacular. They had players like Steven Stamkos, Nikita Kucherov. They had Victor Hedman and a great defense. They had a third line that was among the best in the league, right? With Yanni Gourde and Barclay Goodrow and Blake Coleman. Vasilevsky, best goaltender in the league on many nights between the pipes. I just feel like when we adjudicate, when we make lists like this, people are always going to harp on the shortened season and the bubble and, the Montreal Canadiens should not have made it to the Stanley Cup final and any team could have beaten them. I think that dismisses how incredible the Tampa Bay Lightning team was.
You could even argue it might have been harder those years to get to that point, given all the outside circumstances.
I think it was. I was in the bubble in Edmonton, and I wasn't there as long as Tampa Bay was. I was 37 days. Tampa Bay were there for around 70 days.
Wow.
And mentally, for those players and coaches to go through that and not see their families and have to stay within a 10-foot fence, which surrounded the arena, and 2 hotels. You talk about the teams that went a long way in those playoffs. They embraced it, whether it was the Lightning, the Dallas Stars.
Islanders
the
had
Islanders,
success in those 2
right,
seasons.
the Islanders as well. It was Vegas that lost to Dallas in the Western Final, but I give those Tampa Bay teams a lot of credit. Totally agree with you. They won those Stanley Cups in September and July.
Yeah.
But I think if those were normal seasons, they were a tremendous team, and I think would have won if we had, regularly scheduled seasons during those 2 years.
Yeah. The one team I think that I look at in this 25-year window, that Penguins team that won back-to-back cups in 16 and 17, because they changed the way they played in that run, and they became a speed team. They changed coaches, right? They went to Mike Sullivan, he came in, but they added some younger players into the mix, the Gensels, the Rusts. But they became a real fast team. And I remember watching them play on back-to-back games. In the late regular season, they were playing, I think it was Washington and Philadelphia, and they gave up a combined, I think it was like 33 shots in 2 games. And I walked away from that saying, boy, nobody's going to beat this team. And nobody did in that first year, and they went on to win a 2nd straight cup. So for me, that's a team, they changed the way they played. The game changed a little bit with them. And then it kind of shifted again back with Washington and St. Louis after that to those bigger, stronger defensemen again. So it was an interesting time, but I thought those 2 Crosby teams were pretty special.
Yeah, and I think one team we've overlooked so far, back in the early portion of the century, because it was so long ago, the New Jersey Devils.
Absolutely.
They won their first cup in '95, so that doesn't fit our criteria as far as the last quarter century, but then they win again in 2000 and 2003. It was pre-salary cap, as Arda referenced earlier, but the style they played with a Hall of Famer, Marty Brodeur, Scott Stevens, Ken Danico,
Scotty Niedermayer.
Scotty Niedermayer.
And think about this. Would this conversation be different if they could have finished off the Colorado Avalanche in 2001? You talk to the Devils guys, and I'm sure everybody here has talked to them. You want to talk to them about the wins. They want to talk about losing in 2001 to Colorado.
Yeah,
the
right.
losses always sting these guys much more than the wins make them happy. And that was one they thought they had won. They were home for Game 6. Patrick Waugh shuts them out. They go to Colorado. Colorado wins. Credit to the Avalanche, who were a great team and a great champion as well, doing it without Peter Forsberg in 2001.
Right.
But to your point, Kenny, I think that Devils team, if they win that Game 6, that's 3 cups in 4 years. Right. Maybe we're having a different discussion.
Though they might be a dynasty, hockey is better off having the greatest assist in NHL history, Sakic passing the cup to Bourque.
Joe Sakic immediately turns and hands it to Ray Bourque, who lifts it up and over his head. Ray Bourque, 22 years, had waited for this moment.
That would have been a moment to miss somehow, right? Because it seemed inevitable that Bourque was going to get that cup. But it was a crazy run for the Avalanche in that season because, again, Forsberg, spleen situation. He was out, missed the last 2 series, but they rallied to win, and Patrick Waugh was the guy that got it done.
Conversations we could probably have for hours on
Yes,
this topic, correct?
yeah.
All right, well done, guys. We talked about the teams everyone knows about, but what about the champions you might have forgotten? We'll break it down when we return to the Quarter Century Show presented by SAP. We welcome you back in here discussing the very best Stanley Cup champions of the past 25 years on the Quarter Century Show presented by SAP. And it's hard to believe, guys, there could possibly be a snub for a Stanley Cup champion when you win the most coveted trophy in all of sports. But we're going to go there. And I'd love to start with you, EJ, as to maybe who you think was snubbed in this conversation, who deserves a little bit more, maybe one of the forgotten teams.
Well, I would say the Anaheim Ducks, because anytime you have a defense that has Chris Pronger and Scott Niedermayer, you've got a really good defense. And they had Teemu Selanne as well. It's a team that I think does fly under the radar a little bit, handled the... An Ottawa Senators team, by the way, that was very good in the Eastern Conference playoffs that year. I believe they only lost a couple of games, and the Ducks took care of them in 5. So for me, when you have Niedermayer and Pronger, that is a unique duo to have on the blue line. That's one probably doesn't get talked about enough.
And the Senators had like an insane goal differential that year, too.
Yeah.
So they were a formidable opponent.
Yes, they were.
And I also love this. I mean, obviously in 03, the Ducks make the final. They lose to the Devils. Jaguar wins the Conn Smythe as a goaltender. Very rare on the losing team. Of course, we just recently saw it with McDavid. But then you get the story of the Niedermayer brothers, right?
Yep.
They were adversaries in 03. Now they join forces. They come together in 07, and the team finally wins the Stanley Cup. So there was some cool storyline weaving going into that 07 Cup victory as well.
I think one team that we haven't really talked about that I loved watching during their run, the St. Louis Blues in 2019, a team that had never won a Stanley Cup title. They actually got to the Cup final their first 3 years under Scotty Bowman, but here they were in 19, and the hometown hero, Pat Maroon, grew up in St. Louis, scores the Game 7 overtime winner to send them into the conference final. This is a team that was at the bottom of the conference in early January. Last place in the Western Conference. They made the coaching change, brought in Craig Berube. He changed the style, just such a hard-working team. And they had a rookie goalie, too, in Jordan Binnington. And they wind up getting past San Jose in the conference final. And then on the road in Boston, Game 7, wind up winning that game 4-1 to win their first Stanley Cup.
Absolutely wild. And they beat the Bruins, a strong team. What an all-time performance, right?
Crazy.
They were dead last.
Dead last in January. First-year head coach.
Unbelievable.
Rookie goaltender. They got it.
Well,
And Pat Maroon gets 2 more Stanley Cups after that, 3 straight.
The credit
Good for him.
really for Craig Berube was understanding that Jordan Binnington, when he came in, because a lot of guys might have just said, let me go back to Jake Allen, be comfortable. Jake Allen had his run there in St. Louis. It hadn't worked out for him there. You had someone new came in, he played well. He just kept rolling with him, and it just took off from there. So that's a good one. They had a good team, and again, bigger, stronger, stouter on defense.
Yeah.
A lot like the Washington Capitals were the year before that. Also like Vegas, we've seen them with that style. There's different styles over these last 25 years that help you win the Stanley Cup, and they would fall into that group of bigger and stronger on the blue line.
So we could pick other one-offs like the Carolina Hurricanes in '06. I'm going to go a little off the board because I just want to highlight, we talked about the Los Angeles Kings. They're in that dynastic territory based on their cup final appearances and winning 2 cups. I just want to talk about 2012 for a second because to me, that Stanley Cup is perhaps the wildest circumstance of any in this century. They were a team that limped into the playoffs in the 8th seed. They lost technically more games than they won. And then they turn it around like a light switch. Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. All of a sudden, they were up 3-0 in every series. The final against the Devils never had a lead change, and they were dominant for pretty much all of it. So to see that change, and Jonathan Quick was like a 942 or something.
He had a great performance.
Insane.
Like couple of trades after Jeff
Exactly.
Carter, I believe, came on the scene late.
Just to think
won
of
the first 8
how
road
different,
games.
unbelievable.
Yeah, that's right.
To see how different that team was in the regular season versus the playoffs, we have to give them credit. We don't talk about that enough.
And they win again
And
2
then
years
2
later.
years later, right, with 3 consecutive Game 7 victories to advance to the final against the New York Rangers. I love that you mentioned that, Arda, because that to me is a team that we really haven't talked about on this show, and I think the LA Kings deserve a little bit of credit here, maybe as a forgotten team, if you will. But all great arguments, guys. Thank you so much for your expertise. Really interesting to hear your perspective. And remember, fans can weigh in on who they think are the 25 best players of the last quarter century by logging on to NHL.com/vote or visiting the NHL on X. Voting is open until April 1st, so get online and make your voices heard.
Simply sensational!
One of sports' great moments.
And don't forget to join us next time as we continue to break down 25 incredible years of NHL hockey, only on the Quarter Century Show, presented by SAP.